welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new around here, then my name is Katie and I create lots of art and journaling related content, and in today's video I'm going to be talking all about sketchbooks. So if you've seen my video a couple of weeks back, I shared all of my favourite supplies. I'll link that up in the cards. But I talked about my favourite sketchbook, which is the Royal Talens Art Creation Sketchbook, and I basically use that for 90% of my art. But in today's video I want to compare it with two other sketchbooks. So I've got three here, and they're all from different price points. So we've got the cheapest one, which is the Royal Talens, the next one up, which is the Strathmore Mixed Media, and then the highest, which is the Perfect Sketchbook from Ochre. And I just want to talk through what I look for in a sketchbook and the differences between these. There's a big difference in price and also paper quality, so I think this would be a really helpful video if you are looking at buying a sketchbook and what to look for depending on what your medium is. I'm going to be doing some swatch tests in each of the sketchbooks using totally different mediums, so you can see how the paper reacts, the texture that comes from the different types of finish, and also how it holds up with lots of wet media for the paper weight and the difference in colour. But first I'm going to quickly run through the price of each of these sketchbooks and the paper weight that you're getting. So like I mentioned, the cheapest one, which is my daily go-to, is the Royal Talens Art Creation Sketchbook. They do these in multiple sizes, but the one I've got here and I'm testing today is the 13 by 21 centimetre size. This is 140 grams, it's an ivory paper, so it's quite cream and not very white, and the finish is really smooth. This retails at around £7. The Royal Talens has 80 sheets, so there's plenty in there to get started, but I wouldn't say this one works very well with wet medium, which I'll show you later. Next up we have the Strathmore Mixed Media Sketchbook. This is the 500 series that I'm testing today, and with the soft cover. I bought this one in America, but it retails at around £25, and this paper is slightly thicker. So this is 190 GSM, and the paper is off-white, but it's a lot whiter than the ivory one in the Royal Talens. This is the 19.7 by 24.8 centimetre size, but again they do other sizes in this range, and there are 32 sheets. Lastly, we have the most expensive sketchbook that I have. I actually won this in a Twitter giveaway, so I haven't spent my own money on this because I'm not sure I could ever justify the price, because this one retails at £43. This is the A5. They do this in A4, and this is 100% cotton cold press paper, so there's a lot more of a tooth to this one, but this is the thickest of our papers at 300 GSM, so it takes a lot of wet medium and you can layer things on really nicely. So that's a little bit about the sketchbooks I'm going to be sharing today. I hope that you find this video useful in what to look for in a sketchbook and to be able to see the comparisons. So let's get on to swatching. So I have all three of my sketchbooks here, as I just mentioned, all the different types, and I'm going to be using all of these different materials to show you how they react and sit on the paper. I'm going to be using each of the materials individually and showing you them in each sketchbook as I go. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with the Strathmore sketchbook. This is getting a little bit beaten up now because it is a soft cover. So I'm going to start with some gouache. I'm just using some white and a primary blue. And this is what I use all of the time. I use a lot of gouache in my work, so I've used them in all of these sketchbooks before. This paper here in the Strathmore one is slightly thicker, especially compared to the Royal Talens, but it's not as thick as the Ochre. So I just put some gouache on my palette, and I'm just going to put this down. So it lays really nicely, it feels like it's sitting nicely on the paper, and I want to see how much water I can add. Because it is thicker paper, it can take quite a lot of medium. And I also want to see what the blending is going to be like. A lot of the time I don't worry too much about blending because I use my gouache quite watery, and I use it as a base layer. So I do use a lot of water with my gouache, but in terms of like the granulation when you're mixing colours together, I think that's quite an interesting test and one that I'll be using especially for the ink. So I'll just wet my brush here to try and blend these two colours together. Whilst that dries, I'm going to get my next sketchbook ready. And you can see here an example where the blending is really nice. So this was a really wet medium, and I think this was acrylic ink. So I know that this does handle a lot of wet medium. It has more of a tooth, so it picks up more of the texture. And you can get some really nice effects with this paper, but it's a lot thicker, so there is less pages in a sketchbook. This almost feels like card, it's that thick. So there's our white, and then the blue that it's merging into, and then loads of water on my brush there. This is the whitest of the paper, and then this is slightly creamier, but not as cream as the Royal Talons. So you can definitely see the difference in paper tone here, where it goes from whitest to creamiest. Let's move that out of the way and do the gouache on this one as well. So because this paper is a lot thinner than the other two, it definitely handles the wet mediums slightly differently, but it is also completely smooth. So these two have a bit of tooth to it. They're more like cold pressed paper, whereas this is definitely hot pressed and totally smooth. Go in with the dark blue and then the white. And whilst this dries, we're going to move on to the ink. And I think this is going to be really telling on the Royal Talons. So as that one's out, let's start there. I'm going to be using the Rohrer and Klingner inks. So I've got an ochre and the old golden green here. And again, I'm going to see how they merge together. I'm going to dip my brush in straight into the jar and put that on the page. And I want to use this quite thickly, but because there is no tooth on this page, you can get really smooth lines, which I'm going to test out later with the Neocolors on the toothier pages. So let's pop this on all of my pages. You can hear that one a little bit more. And over here on the Etcher one. So I would say that it's drying a lot quicker already on the Etcher. I can see that it sinks into the paper more than it sits here. But also I can already see on the Talons how the ink has really sat into the paper. So I'll do some close-ups in a second. Let's move on to the ochre. So that's already dried, but I want to see how it layers on top. And then onto the Strathmore. Again, it is drying quite quickly. You can definitely see how it blends together though. So there's quite a lot of medium on this one. And there's no buckling on the page. And then the Etcher. It's really interesting actually seeing the difference in tone. There's already a huge difference because this, you can see the texture there, how it's kind of, the paper hasn't held it very well. You can see where I've gone over, it hasn't really blended in with the green, but that's also because I did this one first. If I see how it's come through on the other side, you can definitely see here some of the marks, and there's definitely a lot of movement on the page. The gouache isn't quite dry, but the colours are a lot more dull, especially compared to the other two. So you can see here, this was the exact same ink, and this has turned out really yellow and a lot lighter than this much more golden ochre. So if I do a close-up on this one, you can definitely see the difference in colour there, and this one blended a little bit more. There's definitely none of the texture from the other one where it had sunk into the page, and it sits really nicely on top, and there's no show through. And then for this one's handled it the nicest, I'd say. Obviously you can see where the green had dried a little bit, but it has started to blend, and I think this has the richest of colour. You can see down here at the bottom where it goes slightly yellow and then the more rich colour here, but that looks really nice on this paper, especially compared to the Royal Talens. Now let's try some brush pen swatches. So I haven't used brush pens in this book before. Again, I want to see how they layer, if I can blend them in. Oh yeah, that blends really nicely. And let's try it with the beige. It lays nicely down because these are quite wet and quite inky. So I was worried about the tooth of this paper, but that layers really nicely. So you can definitely see the blending there. These are the Tombow dual brush pens. Let's try this on my Strathmore. That works really nicely. I can feel that it's pulling up the paper a little bit more than on this one. And then the beige. So I can definitely feel the paper texture coming up. And I'd say it blends nicer, a bit nicer on the other one. And then lastly, my Royal Talens. So I use brush pens in this one all the time. This is like my daily driver sketchbook, but I don't often blend them, so this is going to be a good test. It definitely sits in a little bit more. Again, the texture is quite different. I'll show you some close-ups in a sec. This is definitely pilling the paper, so there's a lot of little bits of paper coming up. So let me show you here. You can see there the texture is coming up from the page, so it's no longer smooth. You can see it's making it a bit rough. There's little flecks. If I push them to the side, you can see them there, where it is pulling up the paper. It's doing it a little bit on the Strathmore as well, though not as much. It definitely feels still quite wet, and I can feel the paper starting to pill again. You can see it a little bit, but not as much as the Royal Talens. But the blending is better, I think. But obviously on the thickest paper it's done the best, so there's no pilling at all. It feels really nice and sunk into the paper. So now I want to see how the pan pastels work. So I'm presuming it's going to work the best on the smoothest paper, but let's try it out. So I've used pan pastels in the sketchbook before, so this isn't a new medium for me. You can definitely layer them. You can layer them with other mediums as well. This one is quite chalky, but you can see a really soft blend there. And this is just using a makeup sponge. So let's move on to the Strathmore. I'm going to use the exact same technique. So that's layered really nicely again. I think the colour looks better on the white. And then I'm really interested in seeing how it works on this etcher. So it does go really nicely into the grooves actually. Again, it's nice and rich. There's definitely a lot more texture here because it's picking up the tooth of the paper. The colours are definitely much richer in the Etcher sketchbook. You can even see that in the gouache. So here's the close-up of the pan pastel. You can see where it is picking up all the little grains of texture, but it's still blended really nicely. Then we have the Strathmore, which again, really nice soft texture, slightly different because there's less of a tooth on this page. And then the Royal Talens. So again, it's very different. You can really see the difference in tone here because probably because this is cream paper as well, but it still blends really nicely. Next up is the paint pen. So I'm just using this Liquitex acrylic marker here. You can definitely hear that texture there. Let's put it over here. But it's not picking up any texture from the paper, it's not pilling it or anything. Let's see if I can blend it out with a wet brush. I think the other paper might struggle with that. So you can see where I've got it a little bit lighter, that's just with some water on my brush. Let's try it with the talons next. So I'm still quite new to acrylic markers and paint pens like this. The colour's definitely a lot closer on this one than it was any of the others, but the water it's sunk really quickly into this paper, whereas it didn't on that one, which meant I could blend it a little easier. And again, I'm getting the pilling. So you can see a really harsh mark there. And then lastly, the Strathmore. Definitely more similar to the Etcher. And there's still a little bit of a line, but not as much. So here's a close-up. It's definitely started pilling it a little bit, and even more water would do that more, but it blended really nicely. Compared to this one where you can really see where it doesn't like the water. So it's definitely come through to the other side, whereas it hasn't on either of the other sketchbooks. So definitely the Royal Talons definitely struggles with really wet media, and you can see where it sunk in so quickly I haven't got that nice blend. Whereas I do on this one, so it's not as smooth as I thought. It has dried a little bit darker, but you can see how it's really sitting on that paper really nicely. So now let's test some Neocolors and coloured pencils. I want to see how it reacts with the tooth on this one. So let's just grab a couple of colours. So this is the effect when you're using the Neocolors on toothy, really textured paper. Obviously you can wet them. This is a dirty brush, but you can easily wet them to smooth that out. But it's the same on the coloured pencil, so it doesn't create a really smooth line. It's a little bit harder. You have to go through it to make sure it goes into every single indentation, whereas I generally just work really quickly, so I would just use my marks like this. Let's try it on the other ones. So it's definitely smoother on this paper, despite it having a little bit more of a texture compared to the Talons, but a lot less than the Etcher. Let's wet this one as well. So that's a really nice technique. And then the coloured pencil, really smooth on here. I have used a lot of colour pencil over gouache in this book, and it's a lot smoother. And then the Royal Talons. So let's start with the Neocolor, really smooth, definitely no problem with texture here. It'll be interesting to see how it takes it with the water. I tend to only use my Neocolors dry, so I don't usually put water with them. And then super smooth for the pencil as expected. So this is still a little bit wet. You can see where it's a super smooth line. There's no missing bits in the pencil line. It's completely smooth and goes over the paper really well. Strathmore next, so you can see there where I've put the water on. The Neocolor line is still underneath, and you can still see a little bit more texture here on the lines, especially compared to the Royal Talons, and even more so here on the Etcher. So you can see where there's a lot of texture in there. It's a really rough line because of the tooth of the paper, so I had to really work to get that smooth pencil line, which I'm not really used to in my work. So I hope that was helpful. I'm really shocked at the difference in colour and tone, and you can see that here from the lowest price point, which is the Royal Talons. the Strathmore and then the Etcher. This brings out a lot of the different colours, and especially in the green you can see it's a lot darker compared to here and here, and even in the ochre from here. This one's not quite as rich, and then this one is a totally different colour completely, and I find that really interesting. If I was doing this sketchbook test without knowing that I love the Royal Talens, then that would probably rank the least in terms of how it holds mediums. But obviously I filled up many pages in these sketchbooks, and because it is such a reasonable price point, I go to it again and again. And for someone who doesn't usually blend in the way that this has been a test on, so I tend to use my gouache quite thickly, so I would use it like this and then put texture on top with coloured pencils, and I do want those smooth lines from the coloured pencils. So I think it depends on what you use sketchbooks for, because if you were after the lovely blending techniques and to have really rich vibrant colours, then these two are definitely winning. I'm really impressed with how the colour looks on these and also the blending, even with the brush pens, and I was impressed with how it took the pan pastels. But for me, this is just too much of a price point for an everyday sketchbook. I would definitely use this for watercolour paintings or granulation like I did over here, because I just can't replicate that in the Royal Talens. But for me, this isn't a daily sketchbook, this is for more finished artwork. And then this one, which is the Strathmore, it did handle things really nicely, and I think the colours are way better than the Royal Talens. It didn't have as much texture on the coloured pencils, so I really like using this one with the wet media and coloured pencils over the top. I'd say it's closer to the Royal Talens in how it holds the wet medium, because there was some pilling, but I think this is a really good middle ground. But again, I prefer to use the cheaper, really thin paper for my day-to-day sketchbook. So I think it does depend on what medium to use. If you like to use a lot of water in your work, then I wouldn't recommend the Royal Talens. I think this is great for thicker paint and coloured pencils and pastel work compared to these. So it definitely depends on your preference with art style, but I think these have been really helpful for me to see how the colours work, and hopefully it's been helpful for you as well. If you have any of these or have your own thoughts and have tested other sketchbooks, please do share your thoughts down below in the comments, because obviously I've only tested 3 here and there are a huge amount of sketchbooks out there. If we all do a couple each, then I feel like we'd have a wide wealth of knowledge, and I'd love to hear from you down below. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next Sunday with a new YouTube video. Have a great week. See you later.